And also thanks to Bernhard for putting together this very interdisciplinary workshop, right? I'm an accounting PhD student at the University of Mannheim, working on this, let's say, not so standard, not so traditional topic for an accountant, together with Felix Federer from MIT and Gerrit von Zedlitz, who is also a PhD student here at the University of Mannheim. And we're starting this project, or let me kick off this project with the basic premise of the paper is that police force is necessary, its misuse is costly. So police officers, we all know that, hold a critical role in Western democracies. They are the gatekeepers of public order and in turn are allowed to use of force. Yet they are also regularly accused of excessive use of force, particularly in very dynamic, anonymous, and emotional situations. We've seen that, for example, in 2017 in Spain, in context with the referendum in Catalonia, the Yellow Vest protests in France in 2019. German soccer games are going to be the setting that we are studying, but also very recently in the US, alongside the riot police, ICE, things that we have seen, for example, in LA. Excessive use is socially costly. It can lead to eroded trust in the police and institutions at large, and can be just costly for police officers and police departments themselves. So the deterrence of excessive use of force is a public goal, but it requires attribution, which should be kind of viewed separately from the sanction component in deterrence. Basically, a sanction without attribution is a toothless effort. Attribution means that knowing who did what in a let's say dynamic situation, the ability to link misconduct to individual officers. Without attribution, again, there are no credible sanctions. If you can't tell which individual police officer did something wrong in a situation, then let's say the highest sanctions are meaningless. In practice, what we do observe is that the what of this part is often known, for example, through videos in, let's say, these days. There's oftentimes footage of, let's say, escalating scenes of crime, but identifying the who oftentimes fails. And you might be surprised, but I'm going to show you some statistics that this is indeed a major threat to deterrence of crime, or at least to attribution. And identification fails typically because misconduct occurs in dynamic situations, oftentimes in riot gear deployments. If police officers act in larger groups, wearing helmets, face coverings, identical uniforms, you cannot tell the individual from another. And typically, in case of a potential wrongdoing, internal investigations could help uncover what has happened in that situation. But what we observe particularly in the context of police is what we call a culture of silence, in the sense that, let's say, internal governance or effort for internal governance inside the police are very hard to enforce, and individual police officers rarely do blame one another for wrongdoing. So what we need is some type of external governance tool that we are going to investigate, and which is going to be an identification mandate. Just again, one step back. Is there an identification problem? There is large international evidence from international NGOs that shows that identifiability of officers is indeed a major obstacle for police accountability. In Germany, the context that we are studying, we do have also quantitative data about this from the statistics of the Federal Prosecution Office and survey evidence, which shows that 86% of cases where riot gear is deployed, 86% of cases in the prosecutorial phase are discontinued, and for more than 50% of these cases, the inability to identify the officer is cited as a reason for discontinuation. This is also a major reason for why we do see identification or policy efforts in the US that push for more identification in the police sphere. There are numerous current US policy proposals that push identification, like the Immigration Enforcement Identification Safety Act, the Visible Identification Standards for Immigration-Based Law Enforcement Act, or the Quick Recognition Act. This is an article from The Economist from late January this year. Again, let's calling for the problem, the issue that we are studying in this paper. It's about a lack of attribution, which hinders deterrence of wrongdoing among police officers. What we see in this paragraph here is it advocates for police officers to stop wearing masks, to start wearing identification numbers. And that's exactly what we're after in this paper. The simple question that we are asking is, does improving officer identification reduce police misconduct? It's a very simple question. We do that in the German context, where we have state-level regulation of police officer of police officers, state-level regulation of police officer identification that act in larger groups in riot gear. Basically, you can think about this reform before the picture to the left. Police officers, again, wearing helmets, uniforms, they look alike. Even face covering. It's very hard to tell which individual is or who is which person in this group. After the reform, we have these alphanumeric codes, typically prominently shown on the back of the police officers on their uniform, and these are individual codes that are anonymized. But when it comes to court, they can be traced back to the individual police officer through an internal registry. You might think that this is a question without tension. We argue that there is at least some tension in the sense that, and police officers oftentimes point this out when it comes about these types of reforms, that more identification could lead to less proactive policing, basically to a situation where police officers start disengaging out of a fear that they might be accused of some wrongdoing when they step in, for example, in an escalating crime scene. So what they argue is that even though we might observe fewer incidents of excessive use of force among police officers, disengagement of police officers might lead to a situation in which we do observe more civilian crime because they start disengage, not stepping in if civilians commit crimes. And these are the types of outcomes that we investigate in our paper. Plus, we do observe prosecution outcomes where we want to test whether identifiability actually changes how cases or accused cases of excessive use of force are handled at court. For that, we use state-level variation of police officer identification laws in Germany. We use very micro-level crime data supplemented with data on soccer matches and prosecution data. We need in this paper a setting where this identification mandate that we want to take a look at, this identification law has bite. And this is the case at riot gear deployment. So that this paper is not about the one-to-one interaction in a traffic stop, for example, between a police officer and a civilian, but this is really about the mass events and police officers acting in groups, again, uniform, helmet, very hard to tell without an identification tag who is who. So we need a mass event. And in our setting, we are going to take a look at soccer matches because they are first a hotspot for violence and also a setting where we do observe police officer excessive use of force among police officers. And second, they are not endogenous to, for example, the expected risk of the event, and also not endogenous to public outrage, for example, public outrage that is in itself a response to misconduct. So these soccer matches, they're mass events, thousands of people attending. They are pre-scheduled in advance. They are not a response to any type of public outrage. And the goal is that we compare similar settings, similar games with and without identification tags. And for that, we use micro-level data that is provided by 12 out of 16 German state police offices. We've basically filed individual FOIA requests to each of these state police offices, and we're able to gain district day-level data on excessive use of force and civilian crimes for 12 out of these 16 German states, which adopted identification laws at different points in time, starting in 2012. Starting in 2012, so far, not all of the German states have yet implemented an identification mandate for its state police officers. What's good about the reform is, or what comes in handy for our research purposes, that these are typically standalone type of reforms, so no concurrent changes in policing. And they are usually, the exact implementation date is typically the result of state-level election cycles and lags in implementation, which makes the specific timing of the implementation at least somewhat random and not endogenous to some outcry or to some scandal. What you see to the right is we have, for a limited number of states, hourly data within day data, so we know the exact timing of wrongdoing. And we just wanted to get a sense for whether excessive use of force among police officers is actually associated with soccer games. And what we plot here is relative to the hour of a game. The vertical line is the start of a game, a match day. Relative to that day, 1 hour, 1 week before, the same time without game, and we plot the excess incidence of excessive use of force. And what we do observe is that 2 hours before, 2 hours post the game, we do observe abnormal incidents of excessive use of force. So there seems to be an association, at least, between excessive use of force and match days, which is kind of a starting point for the later analysis. Again, we use this very detailed, granular district day level data provided by the German state police offices. We complement that with game level, game specific data, which we obtained from the sports unit of the police. And we received proprietary access to prosecution data, which breaks down by state and year case discontinuations among prosecution cases and the reason for that. The basic research design of that we do, or that we impose in the paper, is that we investigate whether there is an increase of cases that we record in the administrative data on match days, and whether this increase of incidents differs before versus after the implementation of an identification tag or an identification requirement for police officers. A very simple example, and we have very granular fixed effects. A very simple example for what we are doing here is there is a game between Eintracht Frankfurt, which is a very popular German soccer club, and Bayer Leverkusen on May 3rd, 2014. We compare the number of recorded incidents of excessive use of force on that day to the same weekday in the same month in the same year in Frankfurt in our most saturated specification. So the Saturday in May 2014 to non-match days on Saturdays in May 2014 in Frankfurt. And we investigate whether that change, match date change, differs pre versus post the implementation of or the introduction of an identification requirements for police officers. Here's our baseline result using that, again, district day level data, microcrime data that we received from the German state police offices. And I want to point your attention to that first row first, which indicates that match days are significantly associated with more recorded incidents of excessive use of force. So we do indeed observe that on match days relative to non-match days in the same district, we do observe more incidents of excessive use of force in the administrative data. This, however, changes post the introduction of an identification mandate. We do observe that about 2/3 of that match day effect is reversed post the introduction of mandatory identification requirements for police officers. And if we translate that into absolute amounts, let's say reduced incidence of excessive use of force of police officers, that amounts to approximately 73 incidents less per year across all the leagues. We do observe the first until the third league, so all the professional soccer matches in Germany. So match days are associated with more use of force, but 2/3 of that effect is mitigated post the introduction of an identification mandate. That also holds in robustness tests and a triple interaction, which I'm not going to highlight given the time. These are the dynamics around the introduction of an identification mandate. We do observe that these are half years relative to treatment. We do observe that sharply after the introduction of an identification mandate, we do observe fewer incidents of excessive use of force on match days. I again want to remind you that there seems to be some tension in this question in the sense that there might be disengagement among police officers following the introduction of the identification mandate. So what we're doing in this test is to take a look at civilian crime levels. So what we would expect is if there was disengagement, that civilian crime levels would increase surrounding match days. So the same type of analysis as before. On match days, we do observe increased levels of simple assault, aggravated assault, and property damage. Post or following the introduction of the identification mandate, we do not observe, however, increased levels of both assaults and property damage. If anything, we do observe decreased levels of property damage following the introduction of an identification mandate. So this would be inconsistent with the reform leading to reduced policing efforts. We complement this with game-specific data. So before this was district day level data. This here is specifically crime. This data relates to crime specifically surrounding soccer matches. So there's a special unit in the police that focuses on soccer matches. So this is data starting in the season 2018-2019. We do exclude COVID and include again the seasons after COVID. And the idea is that we hold the match pairing constant. So we do include match pairing by season fixed effects and investigate differences in civilian crime levels and casualties depending on whether a game takes place in an environment where we do have an identification mandate, in contrast to an environment where we don't have an identification mandate. And one institutional detail that's important here is that, let's say, the violent prone fans fan groups, in Germany, they typically travel to the away games too. So this is kind of holding constant the expected violence level in a given match pairing. And again, what we do observe is that if anything, civilian crimes level tend to decrease. And also we do observe fewer injured civilians at treated games, again, holding the match pairing constant. Again, pointing towards the fact that we rather do not see disengagement among police officers following the introduction of an identification mandate. And we do have a third outcome here, looking at how cases are handled in court. So we have received access to this state year level data on case discontinuations. We do, again, we differentiate states where we have where we do observe an introduction of an identification mandate relative to untreated state, never treated states, which serve as control units in a stacked design. And we do observe that post the introduction of an identification mandate, we have fewer case discontinuations among prosecutions. And these are particularly driven by the non-minor cases, which are likely to be related to severe cases of excessive use of force. Taken together, let me summarize the paper. We do observe that individual identifiability is a key constraint on police accountability worldwide, as becomes evident by recent reforms in the US. We study a German reform that introduces identification tags in a staggered fashion and find that there's a large reduction in police officer excessive use of force post this reform. And there seems to be no evidence of reduced police engagement as measured through civilian crime levels. A potential mechanism for this change in officer behavior is fewer police misconduct cases getting discontinued at the prosecutorial stage. So we summarize, or we conclude this project with identification tags as a low-cost intervention that has the potential of improving accountability in the policing context. Thank you for the attention, and I'm looking forward to Roman's discussion.